Well, Senator Grassley and I had an opportunity this morning, as you know, to meet with the President, Vice President, Senator Reid, and Senator Leahy. We met for about an hour. We spent roughly half of the time discussing the Supreme Court. Senator Grassley and I made it clear that we don't intend to take up a nominee or to have a hearing. And it was a good opportunity to reiterate our view that this appointment should be made by the next president. You've heard all the talking points on both sides, but it does bear repeating that there hasn't been a vacancy created in a presidential election year filled in 80 years. And you'd have to go back to 1888 when Grover Cleveland was in the White House to find the last time a vacancy created in a presidential year was confirmed by the party opposite the occupant of the White House. So this vacancy will not be filled this year. We will look forward to the American people deciding who they want to make this appointment through their own votes. The balance of the hour we spent in a very, I thought, constructive discussion about opioids, national epidemic, and the way forward on that, and I've got Senator Portman here to address that issue. We also had a constructive conversation about the criminal justice reform bill that Senator Cornyn's been in the lead on, and we also talked about the way forward on Puerto Rico. So about half and half on the Supreme Court discussion, and then the other half of the meeting on those three issues that I just mentioned. Since opioids are on the floor, no one has done more on this issue than Senator Portman, and with that, let me turn it over to him.
Thank you, Mitch. I do think that this is one issue where we can come together in a bipartisan way and begin to reverse this devastating trend we've seen in our country of an increase in prescription drug and heroin addiction. 100 Americans will die today, and they'll die of overdoses from mostly heroin, some prescription drug abuse. And in each one of our states, this is a huge problem. In my own state of Ohio, I can't go anywhere where people don't talk about it, whether it's visiting a hospital, they talk about the emergency rooms being filled with people who are overdosing, or whether it's sadly seeing some of these babies who are being born addicted, a 750% increase just in the last 4 or 5 years of babies who are born with this addiction have to go through withdrawal. The care and compassion they get is wonderful to see, but the impact on these babies is really not known, what the long-term consequences might be. I talked to a prosecutor over the weekend who informed me that 80% of the crimes in his county are now being committed by people who are connected to the drug trade, mostly people stealing something to pay for their habit. It's a terrible business model. What the drug traffickers do is they get you hooked on heroin at a relatively low price, and then you need more and more of it to get the same high, and the price goes up and up and up to the point that it can be $1,000, $1,500 a day to support a habit. Addiction's a disease, and a disease needs to be treated. So our legislation does a few things that is really important. One, we've gotten the best experts from all around the country over the last 3 years to give us the best advice on how to come up with more effective ways to prevent people going down the path of addiction in the first place, because this grip of addiction is so difficult. So prevention and education is funded through evidence-based programs. Second, we help law enforcement, including those who are stepping in now to save lives every day. I talked about 100 people dying today from overdoses, but many more are being saved. Naloxone is the miracle drug that in most cases can be able to be used when someone is overdosing to bring someone really back from the dead often. I've had many recovering addicts tell me in the last couple of years around Ohio that they've come back from the dead thanks to a firefighter or a police officer providing them naloxone. So we provide more training for that, more resources for naloxone. That's necessary to do right now, given the problem that we face. We also help to get prescription drugs off the bathroom shelves and to stop the overprescribing by having better drug monitoring programs in place, not just within the state, but interstate, so that someone can't leave one state and go to another and get a prescription filled without someone knowing that they're being overprescribed. And then the legislation focuses on effective treatment and recovery. We know what works. We know what doesn't work. And this legislation actually takes some of the federal funding that is there and directs it to more effective uses to be able, again, to treat addiction as the disease that it is and to begin to overcome this crisis we face in our communities. So this legislation moved forward last night. I was very pleased to see that every single member of the Senate who was here, voted to proceed to the legislation. That's the first step. Now we're going to have a process where people will offer amendments, and I think that's great. There are a lot of good ideas out there. I will say our legislation, again, is the result of 3 years' worth of work, many conferences here in Washington, bringing in experts from all around the country to be able to give us their best counsel on effective treatment and recovery and education and prevention. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse is my co-author of this legislation. We're also working very closely with other members, including Kelly Ayotte and Amy Klobuchar. This is something that, again, has been not just bipartisan but nonpartisan from the start. We need to get this done because we need to start to heal our families, our communities, our country. It's at that level. So I'm encouraged by what I see so far, and I'm looking forward to a good debate on the floor this week and sending this bill to the House, where there's companion legislation that's already been written. It's identical to ours as introduced. It also has support from both sides of the aisle, and certainly we are hopeful we can get this to the President's desk for signature to begin to reverse this devastating trend of addiction in our country.
Well, I'd like to commend Senator Portman and Senator Ayotte and the bipartisan co-sponsors that he mentioned, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Whitehouse, for their leadership on this issue. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation addressing a nationwide epidemic of prescription drug abuse and heroin addiction. And my state has been affected. It's not just the Northeast. I think every state in the country has been affected by this menace. And I hope we'll be able to successfully pass this legislation this week. I would just point out that as a result of the omnibus appropriation bill last year, there is $571 million that is available for spending to deal with this issue. That's something that Senator Blunt, as chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee, responsible for that, made sure was available. And so there are funds waiting there to be spent once we pass this legislation. I mention that because there will be an amendment offered by Senator Shaheen for an additional $600 million that's not offset. In other words, it increases the deficit and the debt. And it just seems ill-advised, to say the least, to appropriate more money when, in fact, there's already $571 million available to deal with this epidemic. So we'll be talking more about that. I hope we'll pass this legislation. We'll do it in a fiscally responsible way, in a way that responds to this terrible epidemic, and get that done this week.
As has already been pointed out, but drug abuse is wrecking lives across this country and crushing a lot of families. Kids are losing their parents, parents are losing their kids, babies are born with addiction, and the statistics are not pretty. 44 Americans die every single day from prescription drug overdoses, and between 2002 and 2013, heroin abuse in this country, heroin use, I should say, in this country has doubled. So it's a very real issue that is having a real impact on people all across this country. And the legislation that we will be voting on is a bipartisan bill. It has the support of 130 anti-drug organizations across the country. It addresses the issue of prevention, it addresses the issue of overdose, it addresses the issue of treatment, and it's a bipartisan bill that there ought to be broad support for. And it shouldn't be a political issue. There's been some suggestion that some might make it that. I hope that's not the case, because this is one of those issues that the American people need us to respond on, and the legislation that Senators Portman, Ayotte, Toomey, and others have worked on, I think is a great step forward and will help deal with what has become a very serious issue for people across this country.
The Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act that's on the floor now is one that I support and want to make sure that we get passed. It is bipartisan legislation dealing with all these issues of prevention, of treatment, of law enforcement. People say, how big of a problem is it? Drugs are killing more Americans today than car accidents. You say, well, isn't it just a problem in the big cities? No, rural areas are significantly impacted, and it's hitting people of all ages. Now, I'm a doctor. I practiced orthopedic surgery for 25 years. I know that pain medication is helpful and pain is real. But pain medication can lead to addiction. And if people go off of the prescribed pain medicine, they can go into withdrawal and then seek more of that medicine or turn to other sources of medicine to deal with the addiction, such as heroin. And I think Washington actually has a role in this and is somewhat to blame. When you take a look at the way hospitals are graded these days, in terms of reimbursement, one of the questions deals with how well satisfied patients are with the care they got in the hospital. And patients are questioned not on the quality of care, but on if the hospital has done enough to deal with their pain. It's a subjective answer to a question that goes and gets sent in to Health and Human Services, and it says, did the hospital do everything they could to deal with your pain? Did the hospital in every way, in how many times did they make sure you had no pain? And these sorts of government regulations, decisions coming out of Washington, can act like drug pushers, encouraging people in hospitals, doctors and nurses, to make sure people get more pain medicine so that they are not penalized by Washington regulations. So Washington needs to respond to this. 26 senators wrote a letter to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, a bipartisan letter, saying we need to know how much this is contributing to the problem, and we want to be apprised of the situation. We do have a bipartisan piece of legislation on the floor. I want to see it pass, and I want to make sure it doesn't become politicized by others, and this needs to be taken very seriously.
Yeah, before taking your questions, there's been a lot of talk the last 24 hours or so about one of our presidential candidates and his seeming ambivalence about David Duke and the KKK. So let me make it perfectly clear. Senate Republicans condemn David Duke, the KKK, and his racism. It has nothing, that is not the view of Republicans that have been elected to the United States Senate, and I condemn his comments in the most forceful way.
Senator, why do you agree with Senator Horn's assessment, though, that some Republicans who were up for re-election in 2016 might have to distance themselves from Donald Trump when they're running for re-election here because of comments like this?
Yeah, but beyond what I just said, I'm going to continue to avoid weighing in on the presidential contest at this point.
Do you worry that your decision on the vacancy for Republicans running for re-election?
No, we're perfectly prepared to take our argument to the American people. We think the American people are in the process already, a big election today, all across the South, in deciding who the next president's going to be. You know the history of this. And I would tell you, if the shoe were on the other foot, do any of you think the Democrat majority in the Senate would be confirming a Republican president's nomination in the last year of his term? Of course not. This is going to be decided by the American people, and the next president, whoever that may be, will fill this vacancy. Yeah.
Do you think that a presidential candidate who does not quickly and firmly denounce the KKK is suitable to be your party's nominee?
I think it's very important that the American people understand that the Republican Party condemns in the strongest possible language David Duke, the KKK, and everything they stand for.
What did you say to President Obama today at your meeting when he asked about the Supreme Court vacancy and the possibilities of hearings? Is there any possibility at all that may change your mind? What did you tell the president?
I told the president what I've been saying for close to 2 weeks now, and what I just said a few minutes ago. Yeah, I mean, nothing you haven't heard.
Senator, on Puerto Rico, what did you tell the president is possible on Puerto Rico?
Well, yeah, Senator Grassley and their counterparts in the House are working on some kind of resolution that obviously would involve almost certainly a control board and give Puerto Rico a chance to dig out of its problems. And the only thing I would reject categorically is there's not going to be any bailout of this problem. No bailout.
Senator McConnell, would Republicans in the House, some conservatives feel, if they take up entitlement reform in the House, that you would be unwilling to take that up in the Senate this year? Can you respond to that?
We'll be happy to look at anything the House sends over on any subject. As you know, just all of you have been around a while, the House can do things in an hour that take us 2 weeks. So we're always going to be flooded with more bills from the House than we can possibly deal with. But I'm anxious to take a look at anything they send us.
Senator McConnell, you reported the New York Times saying that you were prepared to drop Donald Trump like a hawk. excuse me, like a hot rock. Are you prepared to distance yourself?
I don't remember saying anything like that to all of you.
Well, is that something that you probably...
I don't remember saying anything like that to all of you. Yeah.
Kara, the administration has raised concerns that it doesn't have the funding necessary to implement this bill. Did the president raise that with you today? Did he threaten to veto it?
No, look, I think there may be some differences here about how much to spend. That's why we have votes in the Senate. We're going to sort this out. But there's a pretty overwhelmingly bipartisan agreement here that we need to do something and do something now. And that's why I scheduled this particular measure. And we'll work it out through an open amendment process. Thanks a lot.